Good morning.
We're glad you're here, and we welcome you to Workshop 1. It is called the Emancipation History, Process, and Impact. We are going to be led this morning by a dynamic leader. She's Tallahassee City Commissioner. It's Diane William Cox. Give her a hand right now. Thank you. You're in for a treat. She's dependable, she's reliable, and she's an esteemed leader. Ms. Cox.
Thank you, thank you. You can tell she was a teacher, can't you? She said, do it right now. That means y'all dropped down and y'all did it right then, didn't you? I'm gonna pull my mask down for this so that you can hear. And again, hats off and hand clap to the city of Tallahassee. Our communications team is doing a dynamic job of capturing this. They're recording it, and we're getting some still shots. Y'all smile at the camera. Your pictures will show up somewhere. And when the production of these workshops and this whole conference is available, you will find it on the City of Tallahassee site, and we will make sure that you are informed of how you will be able to see these and share them again. So again, thank you all so very much for being here this morning. This is a very important conference, and it's at a very important time. Everything happens in the right time if you believe and if you look at how things kind of come together. Mrs. Barnes and this planning committee has done a dynamic job, and the folks you see here were a part of that planning and bring great wealth and knowledge to this workshop. I am going to, instead of bore you with an introduction of these individuals, I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you in their own way, and then we'll get going with the discussion. Let me just tell you up front that I have some appointments back at my office that I have not been able to readjust. So when I step off, Mr. Lewis, Clifton Lewis, will serve as panelist and moderator to keep the conversation going, because we've got to have this conversation. And I'm looking around this room, and hand clap to those of us with gray crowns, and hand claps to those who have no crowns, and hand claps to those of you who have colors of crowns. You know what your crown is, right? Your hair. To whatever other colors you may have, because it's going to take all of our crowns to get this message out and to get it back to our young people, because we're trying to pass this baton, but we've got to make sure they're ready and that they're informed and they are educated on what carrying the baton means. And we want to make sure they don't drop it. We want to make sure that we march forward with knowledge and with understanding. So we're going to start at my far left with the esteemed Mr. Clifton Lewis, followed by retired. How do I say it? Let me read it. Let me read it. So I want to get it right.
Yeah.
Sergeant Major, U.S. Army retired, Jarvis Rozier. As you see, he dressed very well for the occasion. He'll talk to you about what that means. And we have Dr. Proctor, who is a professor at Tallahassee Community College. And we have Dr. Joe Burgess here. We've just been enjoying each other all the way from Tennessee, right?
Yes.
Tennessee, did you bring in a whiskey with you? Okay, well, next time, bring some whiskey and we'll give you some oranges. How about that? So we'll start with Mr. Lewis. If you would, just take a minute or two to introduce yourselves.
Yes, good morning. My name is Clifton Lewis. I'm the founding president of the historic L.B. Brown House Museum at Bartow. I've been involved with the network almost since its inception. The historic L.B. Brown House Museum is, in fact, a charter member working with Mrs. Barnes. I'm delighted to be here and to participate in this conference. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm retired Army Sergeant Major Jarvis Rozier. 34 years, 4 months, 2 days, like I was counting, of military service. And just glad to be here. I'm the president and founder of the 2nd Infantry Regiment, United States Colored Troops, Living History Association, and our mission is to preserve, protect, promote, educate, and interpret the contributions, the sacrifices of these soldiers that fought during the Union when many people weren't aware of it. I'm Civil War Heritage Coordinator with the John Gilmore Riley Museum, Foundation Chair, and just enjoying what I do. I love history, and somehow Ms. Barnes found out that I did when I retired, and you all know the story if you know Ms. Barnes. So I'm on my third retirement, so glad to be here.
Hi, I'm David Proctor. I'm the history chair at Tallahassee Community College. I'm a native Tallahassean, born and raised here. I earned all my degrees at Florida State University. My parents graduated from there. My grandmother graduated from there in 1905, so I'm very, very local here. But my mission is to teach community college, and that involves somehow finding a way to capture the interest of the 18 to 22-year-old set, which I found to be more than enough challenge for any professional career. Trying to teach history to now what's called Generation Z is a lot. Knowing the history is just the beginning of it. It's how do you take hold of this material and get an 18-year-old to be interested? As historians, all of us are capable at this table of going on for a long time. And we're all disciplining ourselves right now as to how are we going to do our presentations and keep them short. So that's who I am and what I do. And I'm just thrilled, of course, when Althemise Barnes began working on this and wanted me to help out, because you can't say no to Ms. Barnes. She's a Tallahassee legend. And so I'm thrilled to be invited and to participate, and it's a terrific event we have here. But thanks.
My name is Joanne Burgess. I'm from Middle Tennessee. I am Professor Emerita from Austin Peay State University with 35 years of nursing down in the trenches. I did public health nursing, hospital nursing, Army nursing, and I was thinking about retiring, and I started teaching at Austin Peay. I retired and came down here, and they needed someone to come back because the nursing department needed someone with credentials to sign the students' applications so they could go to state boards. So I went back to Tennessee for, it's supposed to have been a 3 months tour. It took me 9 months to get back down here. But I decided after I finished the medical part of my career that I really wanted to document the history of the evolution of education, and it really is a microcosm of the entire South. But we had one school in Clarksville at the time I was growing up, and the history is the journey of that school. It's the odyssey of Burt High School. It's not just about that school. It's from the time Tennessee was established, going through slavery education before, during, and after slavery. So I hope you all will be interested in checking out my book. It was such an honor to be here today. This is such a historic event. I want to thank you, Ms. Barnes, and everyone else that was involved in allowing me to participate. I consider it a great honor. Thank you.
Thank you all. You all are being very disciplined. And thank you. Mr. Lewis and retired Sergeant Major, I'm going to call you Sergeant Major for short, okay. Last year on this very day, we participated in a virtual celebration of Freedom Day. Leon Russell, who I read his comment this morning with chairman of the board, national board of NAACP, and others, to talk about what this day in 1865 meant. And Mr. Lewis, I've heard you say so many times that emancipation is not a day, it's a journey. And so why don't the two of you speak to some of what we did last year, and let's talk about this journey that we're on that started way back before 1865, but this journey that we're on.
Let me begin by saying that in every previous conference I participated in with Sergeant Major Rozier, I've always stolen his thunder and said that he always said, "You just said what I wanted to say." And so let me defer to him. Go ahead, Jarvis.
That's the first time for everything. Because usually when my friend Cliff gets through, I don't have much to say, but it was very important when we got this journey going and when we got it started, like Mr. Lewis said. It's not just a day, it's a journey. And even more so lately, it's even more of a journey when people try to deny history and come up with their own history. And I always say, Commissioner Cox, you know what I'm saying is, history is not an objective story, it's a definitive story. It happened. When it happened, where it happened, how it happened, and who it happened to. And emancipation was a definitive thing. So when we started seeing a lot of people understand, when I go and I travel to different events that we've been to, reenacting and things of that nature there, not only the emancipation, but just I don't know a better word, every now and then I might say a big word up here with all, but just to think the knowledge that's not there, that people don't understand. People in Florida don't understand. People in Florida are thinking Juneteenth is our day that, you know, Florida was emancipated. That's not true. It's not true also that all slaves were free during that time. So it's so important, the Emancipation Proclamation, getting that across. I mean, it's serious. It's not just a day. It's serious. I mean, when you think of emancipation, you think, and when I speak to people, I say, put yourself in that position. Put yourself back in 1862, 63, 64. And then think about why we're talking about what happened to end that for 4 million enslaved African Americans. And then you may think why we do what we do, why it's so important to do what we do, to relay the information and get it correct. Let everyone know that it's got to be a passionate thing that we think, and it's passionate to me. When I started doing reenactments and things of that nature there, going to different Civil War reenactments, because we reenact battles where African Americans fought. We actually represent a real unit, the 2nd Infantry Regiment, the United States Colored Troop, that came into play and up at Arlington, Virginia, came down and joined the Army of the South in Key West, worked their way up, and fought several battles in the state of Florida and wound up at Battle of Natural Bridge. I thought, well, we just put on some uniforms and go down there, but when I tell people, when I turn over a stone, I see pebbles and they keep going and keep going and keep going. And there's so much rich history there. So it's passionate, it's important that those that served and some that gave all. So when we talk about Emancipation Proclamation, we can't just talk about it, what the date is. We can't just say it's a date like my brother Cliff here said, it's a journey. And we're finding it's a journey just to get people to realize and understand that it is a journey, it's a day. It's something that actually happens. So we try, and I always try to make it passionate. When we go to reenactments, a lot of people say, we're so glad to see you all here. I say, well, I'm glad to see y'all here. We were here 150 years ago. You know, that's why we're here. We're representing those that were here 150 years ago. So it's a passionate story, it's a passionate journey, and we all have to have that passion. And hopefully when we leave this conference, we'll have that passion as we're talking about our journey through history and emancipation. Yeah.
I would just like to follow up by saying that looking at where we are today in terms of recognizing the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation and comparing that with several years ago when the proclamation was seldom remembered and widely misunderstood, it just amazes me. I think about a quote that I read someplace where it says, without knowledge of heritage, each new generation starts over. And so it's so important that we let our young people know where we came from. And there was so much misunderstanding about what I call the process of emancipation. It was not a date, it was not an occasion, it was a process. And it was so important that we get into that. It's still some misunderstanding that I observed my good friend, Dr. Larry Rivers, this morning, when he mentioned that maybe the state of West Virginia, as he mentioned those states that were excluded from the proclamation. And I've heard this over and over about the state of West Virginia. It's important for us to recognize that when Lincoln issued the proclamation in September of 1862, there was no state of West Virginia. When he signed the proclamation January the 1st, 1863, there was no state of West Virginia. Lincoln was practicing the old well-known war strategy of divide and conquer. He recognized that the 48 counties of the western part of the state of Virginia had not seceded from the Union as Virginia had. And so Lincoln excluded those coal mining counties from his proclamation because they were not in rebellion. He excluded Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, 48 counties of West Virginia, and of course eastern Virginia and part of southern Louisiana. And so just wanted to make clear in my opening remarks that, and this was one of the small points this was even stumbled over at a conference I attended at in a university in Georgia, where they mentioned about the state of West Virginia. And I said there was no state of West Virginia when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And the proclamation did not do a lot of things. But what it did do, it rung the bell. It started the process of emancipation. President Douglass said that January the 1st should be remembered as if it was 1,000 years because of its impact. A white slaveholder in Maryland said that the proclamation struck the nation like a thunderbolt from a cloudless sky. And so we sit here today trying to fathom what the proclamation did way back then. We need to make sure we transpose ourselves back to that time of the 1860s and recognize what it did. And that's where we were about 5 years ago. Commissioner Cox, when we were talking to Arthur Meeson all about how we proceed with this educational effort to get people to understand what it was all about. And as I close my opening comments, let me just quote the closing words to the proclamation. And we tend to read right through that, but Lincoln said so much when he wrote, and I quote, "And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God," end quote. In closing, Lincoln asked for our considerate judgment of what he had just done. And I'm delighted to see that this is precisely what we're giving it today, our considerate judgment.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Just
all
say one
right.
other thing. And Dr. Lewis was talking about West Virginia. West Virginia came a split, the 35th state. A lot of the West Virginians on the mountain area before they weren't planting cotton, so cotton wasn't big to them. So they're saying, why are we a part of this right here, and it has nothing to do with us, you know. So that's another reason. But when we think about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, most of us remember the last of his words, you know, let freedom ring from the hamlets, and that all men are created. But they don't listen to the first part as much as should be when we're talking about emancipation. You know, you say, I'm happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for history in the history of our nation. He said, 50 years ago, a great American whose symbolic shadow we stand in signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He said, this momentous degree came as a beacon of light for 4 million Negroes who were held enslaved in the tyranny of slavery. He said, it became as a daylight to their darkness of being captive. But he also said 100 years later, I endeavor to say 156 years today, he said, the Negro is still not free. Our minds are not free to think what history is. He said, here, the Negro is still not free. He said, the Negro still sadly crippled with the manacles of segregation and disposition. He said 100 years later, 156 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in this vast ocean of material prosperity. He said 156 years later, the Negro still is sadly crippled. The Negro languishes in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own country. And many times, and we see what's going on today, and listening to Dr. Spoon's video, hopefully that inspired a lot of us also to get started, get charged to what we're doing right now. If we don't listen and we don't pay attention to our history, guess what it'll do? What's it doing now? It'll repeat itself. They can't beat us at the ballot box, so they'll beat us and take our ballots. So just stay inspired. Sorry to take more.
All right, that's okay. Dr. Proctor was, I think you getting ready to shout hallelujah.
I'm fine.
He was going with you. So Dr. Proctor, I heard you say in your opening statement, and I know it to be true, trying to capture the attention of 18, 20-year-olds and Gen Zs, but not just them, some of us.
That's true.
Some of us. We're enthralled with technology. We listen to people who don't know what they're talking about, and we take it as gospel, we take it as true. How do you use this information to get through it? I also heard you mention, too, that history is not required anymore.
Yeah.
When I was in school, you had to take some history.
It's Diane, it's a long and tragic story, but for the longest time in Florida, and most Florida certainly, to be in a community college, an AA degree, or working on your bachelor's at a university, either way, you had to take a 2-semester sequence of history. And any older person you talk to is going to remember that, and most everybody thought that was still going on. Well, the legislatures and the governors started condensing because of the cost, and it takes too long and this and that. Well, they put a 60 credit hour limit on the Associate of Arts degree. And if you go past that, you got to pay big full cost of your classes. So in other words, they're really trying to keep them at 60 hours. Well, you restrict it to 60 hours when it was spread farther, like 64, 68. Something's got to give. And when the pressure started, it was history that got squeezed. And so in about 2015, they created just a little, the legislature had a bill, they just created a little 6-core social science core, and you pick one, and only one of those was a history. And so Bob Holliday, myself, a Florida Conference of Historians, a lot of people, we really lobbied and argued and talked to them about it. And finally, a couple of years ago, we got the civic literacy requirement, which is great, but to graduate with an AA degree, you just have to take either American History 2, which is post-Civil War, or you take political science, introduction to political science. If you take the political science, you satisfy your civic literacy requirement, you can graduate with no history. And that's probably 50%, roughly, of our Florida college students are now graduating without a single history course. And this is after 50 years. I mean, TCC was started in 66. You can look, I've seen the old catalogs, it was 2 semesters, and it was that way everywhere, pretty much, one degree or another. So folks, it has been a huge struggle just to keep history in the curriculum. You've got people pushing STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, which is wonderful. Oh, they need to learn how to write and they need practical skills, or oh, this or that. And all these things are true. It's not like math isn't important or English isn't important. But history is what you build citizens with. It's what you build informed citizens with. And it's so hard to get that across. I mean, this is kind of preaching to the choir, and we're all obviously here and we're interested, but out in the public, it's not this way. And nobody hardly even noticed. And if we hadn't really fought just to get the civic literacy back, I mean, history would have been practically gone. For all your universities and community colleges in Florida. So Diane, I could go on about this. It was been quite the epic struggle, but right now at least half of them will take AMH 2020, which is Reconstruction to the present, but they're still not going to get what was AMH 2010, which is still a course, but that's discovery through the Civil War. So, I mean, they can take these things as electives, but it's really only a history major now that's going to take these courses, and most of them are not history majors. So, yeah, just even keeping it alive as a survey has been a challenge, Diane. I'm glad you asked that. And it's just very important whenever you see a legislator or a college president or administrator, no matter if you ever find yourself with one, you want to ask them, hey, what's going on with the gen ed, general education history requirements. Keep, it's the best you can do.
So if you're able to get them in your class, what are you doing with them?
And now, that's another great question, Diane. Now, since we secured the civic literacy requirement, and briefly they tried to replace that with a test. Oh my gosh, I won't even, but it's now supplementary, the test. We had to fight that battle. But anyway, you never know when you're just going to lose everything. But anyway, Diane, to your question, you walk into the classroom, there's 35, 18, 19-year-olds sitting there. Oh gosh. And every one of them, when you walk in the class, that's how you start. And so what we work on at TCC is, we would love for them to major in history, but the reality is their parents, they're all worried about jobs and everything else. Of course, you can get jobs with history majors. You've got to be a little more creative. But anyway, or any liberal arts. So you got to get them off of that, and you've got to engage them, and you've got to take the stories and simplify and boil them down, but to where you're still accurate. You're not saying things that are wrong, but the attention span today is so short, and that you're still holding their attention. So you got to relentlessly call on them. You've got to keep them going. You've got to be very animated. It's nothing like when I earned my BA, MA, and PhD in history at FSU, and I just saw Dr. Maxine Jones here. I had to run up and get a picture with her because I remember, from when I was a grad student. But, they were more scholarly, and they were teaching us to write our dissertations. This is all very important. But when you get in community college or any university, that all flies out the window. You've got to keep these kids interested. So that's what we work on, and you learn to be animated. You learn to call on them, you learn to just find the interesting angles, and it isn't an academic enterprise. It is, but you're not training them to be history graduate students or things like that. You're training them to just be interested, informed, and curious, so they can leave your class and still be interested in history. That's the thing. Will they take their families to a historic site? Will they maybe read a book or things like that? And of course, you're trained in grad school almost the opposite. You're trained to be this serious scholar. So that, Diane, is what we work on, and we've really been using the local history sites, the local museums. We send students to the Riley House. And this all had to be kind of learned because it was more, okay, teach them how to write a traditional term paper. And that's a wonderful skill, but they're not majoring in history. So we get them to the Riley House. We get them to the old Florida Capitol. We get them to the Grove. And I will tell you, that has been the best teaching tool I've ever, and then we make them write a paper about it. Well, they don't leap up in excitement with that. But of all the many papers and essays and term papers, I've done every type of writing assignment you could think of, personal autobiographies, whatever. They are stimulated by these historic sites because, folks, a lot of families today, between the entertainment, the video games, this thing, the mouse in Central Florida, movies, you name it, they grow up and they've never been to these places. It stuns you because most of us probably grew up, since we're sitting here, more than likely we grew up in families that our parents probably encouraged us to know about this, or we were interested in one way or another. A lot of them are not. I can't count the number of times they say, I've never been to one of these places. And if they come from a poor school, you think Gaston County or Jefferson County, the budgets are not there for field trips and so on. Diane, you're familiar with all those issues. So it's just all about engagement at our level and what we do. But I'm convinced if we're going to continue as a democratic republic, we have got to engage the citizenry with history. History is a fundamental basis for being a citizen, and you can't think about the problems we have today if you either don't know anything, which is in some cases, Or, Jarvis, like you were pointing out, what you know is not really what happened. There's both of those problems. You know, I've had students sit there and tell me either they never heard of it all or, oh, the Civil War was about states' rights, you know? And you know where that came from. It's from their family. And how are they supposed to,
And the
rather
internet.
how are they supposed to know any better? You can't blame an 18-year-old for what he grew up in. So it's a very vital enterprise, and that's you know what we work on, Diane, and hopefully we make some headway.
You should bring the color troops out.
That listen, we got a history festival planned for March 26th, along the lines of the Tallahassee Science Festival. In fact, Anthony Jones, who did that thing, is coaching us and showing us how to use the same form. We're going to have Clayman Plaza. We'll get information out. It'll be wonderful. But I'm going to be in touch with you about having some.
We did work with Mr. Dr. Alexander,
Okay.
and we have been out and did a program there before,
Okay,
so
good.
we'd be glad to come back.
You'll be hearing.
Okay.
We want you in full dress uniform out there.
And since you invoked his name, and I know he's in the room, Bob Holliday, where are you? Reveal yourself.
There he is.
Bob is the chair of our Tallahassee Historical Society, and he was a part of our planning. And let me tell you something, last legislative session, some
my
folks tried to
goodness.
push a Juneteenth bill
Yeah.
without 20th of May, and wherever they went for hearings or whatever, Bob and the crew was there. Bob, Ms. Barnes, they were there, to the point that the folks got mad. Like, how dare y'all push against this? Well, it didn't happen, so we live to fight another day. But this is what we're gonna do this time. Ms. Barnes and I agreed. We're not gonna fight them. We're just gonna let them waffle on out there and it not happen again, because they're asking for it to be a paid holiday. Now, it's not gonna happen. I just don't believe that the state of Florida is gonna pay people to celebrate June 19th. Now, the city of Tallahassee and Leon County, we're paying people to celebrate May 20th. So we'll see what happens. You know, you sometimes just have to let them run on out there. So let's talk about Tennessee.
Thank you.
All right.
I'm Joanne Burgess. I'm from Tennessee. The current population in Tennessee is over 600 million right now. The population of white is 77%. African American is 17%. The education ranks is 30, and healthcare is 40. Tennessee is bordered by more states than any other state in the United States. To the north, we have Kentucky. To the northwest is Virginia. To the northeast is Virginia, northwest is Missouri, right? Southeast is North Carolina. Southwest is Arkansas. And due south, we have Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. It's 8 states. It was the 16th state to join the Union, June 1, 1796. In 1860, there were 7,300 free blacks in Tennessee. On February the 8th, 1861, the Southern delegates met in Montgomery, Alabama, and established the Confederate States of America. And Tennessee voted to secede from the Union on June the 8th, 1861. February, March, April, May, June. March, April, May, 4 months. This was the 11th and the last state to join the Confederacy. The majority of Tennesseans did not really agree with the secession, but they were afraid that Lincoln was going to abolish slavery, so they voted to secede. You know, Tennessee's nickname is the volunteer state. Tennessee acquired the name the volunteer state when on April the 12th, 1861, President Lincoln asked for volunteers to fight for the Union. This was after the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. Remember that? And 1,500 soldiers volunteered to join the Union Army. On February in 1862, you all know the name, Ulysses S. Grant and the United Navy took control of the Tennessee and the Cumberland Rivers. And I had pictures of the Cumberland Rivers, what it looked like back then, and we'll get able to see those this afternoon. The Cumberland River runs through Nashville and Clarksville. Usually rivers run just the opposite, but this is really unique. And in April, Ulysses S. Grant and the U.S. Navy helped the Confederate Counter-Attack on Shiloh. In 1862, the Union Army occupied much of Middle and West Tennessee. And Tennessee was under Union control in 1863, and Andrew Johnson was the military governor at the time. Remember Andrew Johnson? Now, Johnson's primary concern was to reserve the Union. He wanted preservation of the Union. Nashville was the first Confederate state capital to fall after the battle in Murfreesboro in early 1863. Remember Andrew Johnson? I should remember his name. Mm-hmm. He freed the personal slaves, his personal slaves, on August 8, 1863. This was in Tennessee. By the end of 1863, the newly freed men went to Clarksville, Tennessee, that's my hometown, and enlisted in the Army at Fort Bruce. And on the slide, you will see what Fort Bruce is right up off the bank of the Cumberland. And if you read my book, you read more about Fort Bruce and Fort Defiance. I'm sure you're familiar with Fort Defiance. These men brought their families, because to these men, it was like having some say and action about being free. And plus, being in the Army provided them some source of protection. Now, on October the 13th, 1864, Andrew Johnson again, he was quoted as saying, before the rebellion, he was in favor of sustaining the government with slavery. But now, this is in the middle of the war, he favored sustaining the government without slavery. Johnson said it was his opinion that freedom will not make Negroes worse, and freedom will result in their advancement. Now, Johnson was a Southerner, but he believed in the Union. But he owned slaves. And he believed that individual states should make many political decisions. He was quite a diverse person. Johnson, as military governor, freed all of the enslaved men, women, and children in Tennessee on October the 24th, 1864. Now, there were those who questioned how did a military government had the authority to free enslaved persons in Tennessee. In December 1865, this was, let me back up, February the 22nd, 1865, a statement was added to the Tennessee Constitution that all enslaved persons in Tennessee were free. And then, of course, in December was the 13th Amendment. Tennessee rejoined the Union on July the 4th, 1866. Tennessee was the first state that had seceded to rejoin the Union. Now, let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Tennessee brings a unique perspective to its response regarding the Emancipation Proclamation. And I chuckled when he said journey, and I showed her journey. Yes, because every designated date or destination, it has a journey. It has a beginning. And the journey to designate August 8th, as a Tennessee state holiday had its beginning when Andrew Johnson freed his personal slaves on August the 8th, 1863. That was 7 months after the President's proclamation on January 1, 1863. Of course, we know his primary proclamation was back in September, and then Lincoln warned the people in rebellion and said, now you either free, if these people are still enslaved by the first of the year, I'm going to free them. Well, they were, and he did. So on January 1, 1863, President Lincoln announced his proclamation for slaves being held in states that were in rebellion to the Constitution were free. Tennessee was not one of those states mentioned in the proclamation because Tennessee was under Union control, and Lincoln and Johnson agreed that they did not believe that Tennessee was in rebellion to the Constitution. Nashville, I'll say Nashville and the capital, because at one point they was thinking about Knoxville being the capital, had been under the administration of the military governor Andrew Johnson since 1862. Now remember, on August the 8th, 1863, Sam Johnson was one of Andrew Johnson's former slaves, and he was freed in 1863. In 1871, Sam Johnson, former slave of Andrew Johnson, was successful in having August 8th as a day of observing Emancipation Day celebration in Tennessee. The first recorded celebration of August the 8th as Emancipation Day was in Greenville, Tennessee. That's sort of east. In 2007, the governor then was Bredesen. He signed the House Bill number 207 acknowledging August 8th as Emancipation Day, an annual day of special observation to recognize the freeing of Andrew Johnson personal slaves and the significance of emancipation in the history of Tennessee. In 2020, House Bill 1544 was passed. My time's okay?
You're good. I'm checking my time.
Okay. So, House Bill 1544 proposed a bill to designate August 8th as Emancipation Day as a legal state holiday in Tennessee. Now, Tennessee knew what was in the pipeline. Everybody knew Juneteenth was coming. So a group in Clarksville formed a big celebration for June 19th in the regions of Tennessee. And Clarksville had the best show out. My sister from New York came. I had 5 generational children there, in-laws there. It was a big, and they invited me because they knew my book was about the evolution of education. It included Emancipation Proclamation and how education evolved before, during, and after the Civil War. So on February the 2nd, 2021, the City Council in Clarksville, Tennessee met and an ordinance was passed to make August 8th an official paid holiday because the freed enslaved people had an impact on the Civil War. The impact changed the lives and the history of millions of Americans. On August the 6th, 2021, a parade was held in Clarksville, Tennessee. I was called back for that. My book was presented as a float. My sisters came from New York and Maryland and everywhere, and I had 5 generations there. But the purpose was to kick off the Emancipation Day celebration in Clarksville. There were over 50 floats of parades there. And the purpose and the emphasis was to let people understand the importance of the freedom of the emancipation, what it gave to people, including the freedom to read and be educated. And we decorated one car with banners about the emancipation. We're free to read. We had pictures of the book on it. We made T-shirts, and people carried long banners. I had all of my grandchildren and children, and that is the key. It has to start at home. We can't wait until these children get in school and expect for them to learn everything. We have to talk to our children, our children's children, and that's the key. Charity begins at home. So I want to say that the main problem, or the main purpose that we should emphasize is educate, read, read, read. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very good. All of you have given all of us a lot to think about, and we have a microphone here that if the audience has questions, we want you to feel free to use the mic so that we can capture your voice in the recording. As I was sitting here listening, I'm reminded, and if Ms. Barnes was in here, she would share it, and some of you know it, local folks know it, that May 20th has been celebrated in this area since 1865. The reading of the proclamation at the Knott House, which is not very far from here. I'm told, I wasn't there, but I was told that folks came out of the fields and left their pails and whatever else, and they began to celebrate. And the first celebration was held, and Jarvis and Dr. Proctor, you all probably know this, at Lake, what is now called Lake Ella.
Bull Pond.
Bull Pond is what it was called then. Now it's called Lake Ella. And it has continued all of this time. For those of you who were here last night, Secretary of State of Department of State was here. They have supported this celebration of Juneteenth. They have supported the celebration of the Emancipation Day for Florida, May 20th, for a number of years, including during the pandemic. We have done the reading of the proclamation virtually. We've all kind of taken pieces of it and recorded it, and you can go out and find it at the Department of State site. So, and we also, there was a festival held downtown, holding festivals downtown, and leading up to it, Jarvis and his group do a reenactment in one of our historic black communities, and it kind of leads up to what we're doing. And there's also a ball that takes place where you wear period wear to commemorate that. So we have a celebration. What happened earlier this year was the solidifying of that date by the city of Tallahassee and by Leon County, and giving the opportunity for folks to celebrate it without fear of not being paid, for city employees and for county employees. So we're good in where we stand on it, but we need others to join us. And this is gonna be my final remark. I do have to step away, and I'm gonna, you know how you do on Zoom, where you make somebody the host? So I'm gonna hit the host button, and Mr. Lewis is now the host. So thank you all, and I'll see you back this afternoon. I'll be back as soon as I can.
Can I say one thing before you go,
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Cox? I just want to applaud Commissioner Cox for the work that she's done.
Thank you.
The work that she's done. I remember when I first met Commissioner Cox, we were doing our walk, where we have a walk through living history in Speed Spencer Stevens Park on the south side of Tallahassee, one of the parks she was talking about. And I noticed it was during the political time, and I noticed somebody on the stage talking. I said, "Who is that?" Because we wasn't supposed to be politicizing anything, but that just showed me right there she was a go-getter, and she's been going and getting it ever since. And she's the driving force, her and Ms. Barnes, with this right here we're doing now, but she's always the driving force. She was the driving force of Tallahassee, and then Leon County said, well, we got to do it as well, celebrating May 20th as a paid holiday. So I just want to give her a hand in doing something.
thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Cox.
One other thing, I have a very good friend of mine here, Jackie, I'm gonna put you out there. Jackie Perkins, whose father and mother were very influential in the South Side and Barnes subdivision. We all grew up. I've been knowing Jackie since I was 5 years old. We went to elementary and junior high school all together there. Jackie had me in walkouts and Jackie has been, she's been standing up ever since then, but we just renamed the Gamble Street, which was a street named by a slave owner, slave sympathizer. Nobody knew that. We've been doing Gamble Street all of our life. But Gamble Street now, another one of Commissioner Cox's works with Jackie is now named Robert and Trudy Perkins Way. It goes through families. I just want to say that.
And the real beautiful thing about that is it runs through Florida A&M's campus.
Runs through the campus.
Yeah, so we've gotten that slave owner's name out of FAMU's campus and have the name of some great American heroes and sheroes. So,
I just wanted to say that for you.
thank you, thank you, thank you. Carry on, host.
Thank you so much. I want to follow up on what Dr. Proctor mentioned. You know what's going on now in the state legislatures and school boards to diminish the importance of history. And it suggests to us that teaching history in our homes becomes more important than ever. But I'm reminded of the saying that you can't teach where you don't know, and you can't lead where you won't go. And so while we say that parents ought to teach the children, what are they going to teach? And so really it's incumbent upon our churches, you know, where much of our resources are housed. We have professors and business leaders and in those churches. We really must urge our churches in particular to get back on board, to take the lead, to begin having maybe one Sunday or a month or something, some kind of a program where accurate history is being taught, and also the importance of nonprofit organizations to promote that history. It's so very important. I also want to mention about all these different dates that we hear in Tennessee. Washington, D.C., for example, celebrate, I think, April the 8th as there, because Washington, D.C. was indeed the first place, and indeed the only place, where slavery was ended by a state legislature. Later on, I think Maryland may have ended by it. But in 1862, in April of 1862, the slaves in Washington, D.C. were freed, and that was the only place where the slaveholders were compensated. They received about $1 million for those slaves that were freed in Washington, D.C. in April of 1862. That was that indeed was how Lincoln wanted all of the slaves eventually to be freed by compensation. And of course, you know, he wanted colonization and all that, but that was his main thrust was for colonization. I want to also just mention, and I'll call on another panel member, when we think about the process of emancipation and all these different dates and what should we celebrate, think about the Declaration of Independence. We know that the founders declared and signed the Declaration of Independence on July the 4th, 1776. That's when it was declared. And yet, independence did not really come to this country until after the end of the Revolutionary War. The end, and when the Constitution was finally signed, I think 10 or 11 years later. Well, the same thing happened with slavery, emancipation. Lincoln proclaimed freedom on January 1st, 1863. And while many slaves did indeed leave the plantation, true freedom did not come until 2.5 years later when the Civil War ended. In 1865. So kind of think about that. This was why, for example, I believe Frederick Douglass never talked about the 13th Amendment. He always talked about the Emancipation Proclamation. Because that's when the bell was rung. That's when the foundation of the Confederacy was shook. That's when things started to happen on January 1st, 1863. And so I just wanted to share those things. Now, are there any other panel members want to comment, and we'll start taking questions from the audience?
There's so many dates that we're talking about now, and I said I wasn't going to get into the Juneteenth thing, but it's kind of hard not to. It was hard to witness on national TV when June 19th, 1865 was designated the day that all slaves became free. And everyone in here should, and we all know that that wasn't the date. That was in June 19th when General Granger rode into Galveston, Texas, and read General Order Number 3, and Texas became the last of the 7 states in rebellion that had not returned back to the Union. That was a day that Texas should celebrate, and we celebrate with them. But May 20th, 1865 is the day that we should celebrate, and they should celebrate with us as well. When I was watching it on television, I was seeing the President of the United States sign into law another bill that we can have a barbecue on. That's basically all it is. We can cook out again. You know, we get a day off to get the fire started early. And then to have the Vice President, I must say, come before the nation and say, well, all slaves were not free. If you all noticed that, on June 19th, not until the amendment to the 13th Amendment were they free. December the 6th, the day that we sit here right now, 1865, was the day that all slaves were still held free, because slaves were still in Delaware, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and other territories that hadn't become states yet. So, you know, and for Florida to follow that is a little disgusting, whatever you want to call it. And, you know, to not say it's not true, just tell it what it is, a lie. So we got a national holiday on a lie. But, you know, it's going to take us, those that are here now, that have a passion for getting history right, you know, to do that. Because when you deny your history, you deny your existence. And that's what we did when we did that. You know, I think John Henry Clark, you know, I think what he said, history's not everything, but it's a start. It's a start point. So history is a clock that people use to tell the political and cultural time of the day. It's a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. You say, it tells us who we are, what we are, but more importantly, it tells us where we come from and where we still must be. You know, it's just, history is not objective, it's definitive. You know, so I said I wasn't going to talk about Juneteenth, but it's kind of hard to do so. And, but, you know, I represent the United States Colored Troops, those soldiers that fought during the Civil War. Over 200,000 of those gave, you know, the ultimate, that fought. Over 68,000 gave the ultimate sacrifice. And people say, I wear the uniform. I wear the uniform. You know, when you're talking to an audience, Dr. Proctor, I think the toughest one to talk to is an elementary group.
Ooh,
You know,
that is a
at a
challenge.
kindergarten group or the elementary group, you get that attention span is that like that. You know, but when I wear the uniform, I have my saber. You know, I'm not saying you're all elementary. I just would. I thought I would wear it because my unit, we teach living history and living history. What is living? Living history is not. When you know your history, you perceive. When you see it in living history form, you can conceive it. You can perceive it a little bit more. Because the uniform that I wear now is the same uniform that those soldiers wore of color 150-some years ago. You know, I wasn't there. If I was there and still looked this good, I'd be selling the product. But that is who we represent. And Florida became a state, Dr. Ernie, in 1845. And 15 years after that, seceded from the Union into Confederacy. During that time, there were 140,000 population in the state of Florida. 63,000 of those were enslaved African Americans. 63,000. Leon County had a population of 12,343. 9,089 of those were enslaved African Americans. Tallahassee, Leon County was 73% African American during that time, but enslaved African Americans. 60% there were more that were free, but freedom during that time for an African American wasn't much. Because you could have been with the fugitive slave laws and things of that nature there. So I tell you, it's a passion that we talk about, and it's a passion for me because my studies, and I look at a lot of atrocities that happened during the Civil War. We saw some of the, you know, everybody's seen the movie Django, you know, things of that nature there. That's even more, because in Tennessee, have you ever heard of Fort Pillow? Fort Pillow. Fort Pillow was a cry for the USC soldiers early on. When General Bedford Forrest came into Fort Pillow. There were 292 soldiers, and I think you said something about some of the families were with them there at these forts as well. And they were outmanned about 4-1. And Fort Pillow was a massacre. They massacred over 230 soldiers and civilians. Only 60 survived. Bedford Forest, I think they want to put a monument coming into Tennessee to represent Bedford Forest. Jacksonville had Bedford Forest High School. A lot of these schools and a lot of places, like we mentioned, Gamble Street, named after these Confederate generals or sympathizers or whatever. But if we don't, when we deny our history, we deny our existence. And it's my hope and prayer that this conference and what everyone has to say here on this panel and other, and amongst yourselves, will ignite us to go back with a passion. You know, emancipation in Florida was May 20th, 1865, and we can't let that die to celebrate another state's emancipation. We'll celebrate with them, but we want them to celebrate us too. Now, I won't name somebody, but Senator Brady, but in the law that was passed, that they were trying to pass, it's compensation, well, that's everybody else is doing it, 46 states are doing it. Okay, if 46 states are going to jump over that banner down there 3 floors down, are we going to follow them because we know it's not right? No. Okay, I digress.
Any other panel members would like to make comments?
No, I think what Jarvis said is very relevant and very true. It just all comes back to engagement and getting people interested and building it from the ground up. When I finish every class I teach, I say, if you decide to have families, maybe you already have children or you plan on them in the future, incorporate history and make it fun. Take them to historic sites, battlefields, reenactments, and that's how you really build it. My parents did that with me. We would hit battlefields and museums and all kind of things, and it was just a regular thing. But for so many people today in the rush of life and the trying to make a living and all the complexities, history becomes an afterthought. This is a tough society that we're in. To build history, we're always running around. We have an appointment, we have a job, we have this or that. Quiet contemplation is hard. And so any little thing that you can do if you're a school teacher, if you're working at a museum or whatever, it's the best, this is the most practical thing I know, is to get children interested in these sort of things and use the historic sites and the museums. Nothing that'll engage them more than that. So I just want to second that, and we're finding it so useful with the college students to get them in the museums. And it's hard for us as professional historians. If we go through academia and history, we get trained, that way. And that's important. That's the core, so you know what you're talking about and you know the facts, but it's the communication. It always comes back to how you communicate that. And having been involved in the profession a long time, I've seen historians try to communicate and either it goes on too long or it's too detailed or whatever, and it's not working. So it's an art, to communicate history, but there's the knowledge base, then there's the communication. And any little thing we can do anytime for that communication is so important. I just have to say. And if I can give a quick shout out, Bob Holliday, and Commissioner Cox mentioned him. He's done a lot. He was very involved in meeting with legislators and trying to explain to them what was happening with the history requirements in college. A lot of them were not fully aware of it. They are term limited. They often don't know what was passed before or whatever. But it was arcane. You get into credit hours and 60 hours and AA degrees, it all kind of eye-glazing. But Bob Holliday went down there and got the message across that, wow, the 2-semester requirements are gone. We're just got a little social science basket. Most of them aren't even taking history. And we managed to get them to change it so that there's at least the civic literacy, and they at least can't graduate without either a political science or American history. It still should go back, if you ask me, they should have to have 2 semesters of history to graduate. But maybe one day that will come back. And it happened so much like the Juneteenth thing happened. It wasn't that anybody sat down, we're going to eliminate the history requirement. There's this, need math, need science, need this and that, it costs too much. All these are valid concerns, and they just sort of shook out a bill and didn't really get the overall picture. It's like Juneteenth. It had a catchy name, it was famous in Texas, it popped up, they talked about it, and everybody said, well, we need something to commemorate the end of slavery. But it wasn't, things aren't thought through, Jarvis, I think you would agree. We're a rush society. And probably a lot of states are like, oh yeah, we need something to commemorate. Well, there's June's Boone, next. That's how this stuff works. So it's all about communication and so on. But the Juneteenth thing, the ball just got rolling and nobody really knew all the history behind it. And hey, it's a great holiday and it's a great thing. We should celebrate it, but it didn't, it doesn't tell the story for states like Florida and everybody else. So that's that's the challenge we face is how do you engage people and how do you communicate? It comes down to that every time.
Well, let me just mention before the doctor comments that I advocated for January the 1st because I thought that's when the bell was rung, but December 6th would have been fine with me. But in each instance, the arguments I heard from politicians that I spoke with was the time of the year.
Yeah.
Juneteenth was in the middle of the summer, great time for barbecues. January the 1st is competing with the Rose Bowl game and all the other football games, and December 6th is just before Christmas. And I said, but history is what it is. Right. And so how are you going to change it? I understand before, Doc, there's a question that's being asked. Can you hold on a minute before? Yeah, Bob?
Let me say, first of all, that Dave and Commissioner Cox give me way too much credit for this literacy thing. I mean, we had a team.
In order to be on the video, you need to speak in the mic. Would one of the fellas like to control that mic to take it to the speaker?
I feel like a lounge singer here. Let me say, first of all, that David and Commissioner Cox give me way too much credit for this civic literacy thing. We had a team at TCC, and the school itself let us do it, which was remarkable. But I actually have a question about Tennessee. I'm originally from Nashville, and my question is, why did you guys choose August? Why did you guys choose the date that Andrew Johnson freed his slaves, as opposed to when the Tennessee Constitution was amended to free the slaves?
When I researched it to see, did it in favor just to appease him, did it as a honor to Andrew Johnson.
Right.
They decided to use that day because he. I'm trying to find the right word, but anyway,
it's okay.
They gave it to him.
Yeah.
That's not what it was about.
Yeah.
They said they did that to honor the day that he freed his personal slaves.
Because he must have done something good, right? Sometime.
Somewhere
He must
along
have
the
done.
line, when you know the history of Andrew Johnson.
Yeah.
10 minutes wouldn't put me in the
Yes,
to how he flipped and flopped.
Just Google one of the historians' rankings of presidents.
That's right.
Andrew Johnson.
Somebody
yeah,
has to be at the bottom.
First impeached president.
Yeah.
Anyone else have questions?
Anybody else want to ask a question, please use the mic so that you could be on the video.
My question is to Mr. Proctor. What about the option of increasing the requirements for the AA degree? Make it 65, therefore,
Right.
because we understand the importance of having both of those history credits. So is that an option to approach the legislature about, hey,
I think
let's increase the credit hours requirement?
I think it is. I mean, the legislature had concerns about time to degree and about cost and so on, which are, those are perfectly valid considerations when, obviously. So then there was, a guy named Representative Proctor, no relation, but some years ago, he said, well, we need to get some established corps to make sure that they're all getting these things. And that's when that social science corps was created, and he didn't really think about history as its own discipline. It's not social science. They're thinking social studies. Well, in college, social science can be political science, economics, psychology, sociology, anthropology. It's a long list. I don't think they fully were cognizant of all that. So it's a complicated issue, and of course they have so many other things on their plate. But I think that a coherent argument could be made that when you cap the AA degree at 60 hours, you just don't have room for history. If you're going to have a social science core, if you're going to have a humanities core, a math core, a science core, and an English core, something in there has to give. It's just there's not room. It's trying to pack too many things in. I think if the legislature was approached with the, hey, look, if we could go back to like 64 hours, you would have room for a nice 2-semester sequence of history that makes sense. For years, ever since the community colleges were started, the universities were started, you had what was essentially an AA degree. You go back to Florida State College before it was FSCW, before 1909, and they had a 2-year program that was essentially all these things. So you could make the argument that, hey, we've got to not be wedded to 60 hours. How do we get a nice 2-semester history core where you can start with the meeting of worlds, with Columbus, all that, explorers, Native Americans, everything, and in 2 semesters you can get from there all the way to the present if you got 2 semesters in a nice orderly fashion. And that used to be the option all over the state. You could take 2 semesters of American, 2 semesters of World, or 2 semesters of Western Civ. And that's the way it was most places, with the American history being the largest one because students gravitated there because they thought, well, that's what I had in high school and I remember it. But either way, you've just got to find room for AMH 2010 and AMH 2020, which split at the Civil War. And we used to have that for years, and I would, when you'd teach 2020 a lot in the second semester in the spring. Kids would come in the fall, they'd take 2010, they'd take 2020. And it used to be they were coming out of 2010, and they knew they had a good knowledge base of American history. Now, they haven't had that. So you try to start with Reconstruction, and they don't have the Civil War straight, they don't have anything. And so then you end up trying to explain that. And so I think ultimately, if we talk to the legislature, it's about, come on, you got 2 semesters of science, you got 2 semesters of math, you have 2 semesters of humanities. History is essential for citizenship. You just got to keep making that argument. It can't be set aside because, oh, we need STEM, or, oh, they need to write. History is what ties it all together. And I would love to approach them with, could we somehow get off that rigid 60-hour cutoff and have room for 2 semesters of history that make chronological sense. They take the first part and they take the second part. And I think it did worlds of good when we had it. And we haven't had it now since really about 2016, and boy, when you walk into class the first day trying to teach the second half of it, which is what's in the social science core and the civic literacy, it's tabula rasa. It's just blank slate, and K-12 tries to do the best they can with it, but think of all the competing needs that they have and all the things they're supposed to cover. Not to mention trying to hold a 16-year-old's attention. We should never forget that part. But there's only so much. K-12 teachers work hard, but there's only so much they can do with everything else that's on top of them, and one mandate after another, and this and that. So there really is a need for a broad 2-semester survey in both the universities and the community colleges. To earn your first 2 years Associate of Arts degree, you should complete 2 semesters sequence of history. Just like you take 2 semesters of math, and you take 2 semesters of science, 2 semesters of English. Why is history not in there as important as all those others? It's just a mistake. It's a huge overlooking of what we need. So yeah, I'm always for that. Maybe if they were concerned about cost, they were concerned about time degree, which is very valid, and that's how it got shrunk to 60, and then that's how you ended up with these cores, and there wasn't room for 2 semesters in college. And of course, college is separate from K-12. K-12 has its own set of requirements and issues and so on. So yeah, it's a worthy cause. If you ever find yourself near a legislator or a college president, as I always say, don't be shy. Bring it up. Say, why can't we have 2 semesters of history like we have so many other things? How can you possibly argue history's less important than those other ones? I think it's essential. If you're going to have, I think so much of our political division and our polarization stems from a lot of things, but it stems from a public that isn't thinking historically. It's just whatever shiny thing pops up in front of me. There's no historical background. So anything that can be done to strengthen historical literacy, I think in the long term, whether you're liberal or conservative or Republican or Democrat, whatever you are, in the long term, you get a better debate, a better discussion. I think you get better politicians. Yeah. So terrific point. Terrific question.
Our mission is just 1 minute, please. Our mission is to discuss the Emancipation Proclamation and the history thereof. But while we're doing that, let me mention there were a number of developments. Richard, hold on a minute. A number of developments that occurred. One of which, of course, was the development of the United States Colored Troops. But you also hear about the Buffalo Soldiers, and I just want to comment and bring this into the discussion while you're at it. The young man who's holding the microphone is Richard Wilder. Mr. Wilder, like Mr. Rozier, who heads up the United States Colored Troops, Mr. Wilder is the president of Buffalo Soldiers, Florida. He also reenacted United States Colored Troops, and I want to just take 1 minute without getting all the battles and the casualties. Richard, would you please tell the audience what's the difference between the United States Colored Troops and the Buffalo Soldier? Is there a difference?
Thank you for asking that question. There is a difference, and yet there isn't a difference. You can't talk about Buffalo Soldiers unless you go back to the Civil War and talk about U.S. colored troops. Because the members of the U.S. colored troops are what made the Buffalo Soldiers, because they were, in the beginning, one and the same. You had veterans, hard veterans from the Civil War, a lot re-enlisted in 1866 after the the Reorganization Act. These men re-enlisted, more than half re-enlisted. They had nothing else to do. There was no work. Half didn't have education, so they continued in the military. They gained education. They traveled. They sacrificed. They faced racism. So there is a difference, but yet they're one and the same in the beginning. Because in 1866, those veterans from the Civil War are the ones that made up what would later become known as Buffalo Soldiers. If I may, while I have the mic, because I have a question. We heard earlier that there were, I think, 12 school districts that were, I guess the phrase is exemplary. So then how do we get the other school districts within the state to fall in line? And at the same time, what do we do within our own communities to help bring about this change and spread this knowledge of May 20th and the history that followed? We talk about the Civil War. So my question is, what can we do within the community to help bring about this recognition? So that's a question for any member of the panel.
If we can make the answer kind of brief, because we do have a lady who's been asking, popping her hands up. Somebody wants to address Mr. Wilder's question. Here, there's an audience person who'd like to answer your question.
I haven't been a member of the African American Task Force for the state of Florida, and also have been a former Leon County School Board member. I was on the board, and each board member had to go back to their county. You know, we have 67 counties in the state of Florida, and we only have 12. But each person in here can go to your representative or your senator of your county and request for them to recognize and vote and ask for the school board and the superintendent of your county to become exemplary in African American history. It's up to you to do it. Go to your representative and your senators and ask them. If you may be a vocal citizen yourself, you can do it. Go to your school board members and your superintendents and tell them that you want to become an African American exemplary county. That's how you become exemplary.
Now, Richard, there was a question in the back of the room.
Thank you so much. I'm Wallace Tenney. I represent the Florida Black Historical Research Project in Miami. We're in Miami, but we do most of our work in Palm Beach County with the Loxahatchee battlefield, where the so-called Seminole Wars. But my question really has to do with the nature of history and how we have, when we have a country where what's so-called critical race theory is treated as if it's some kind of political anomaly, we really have a problem, because basically when most of the people on January, and I guess this is not the question, well, anyway, on January 6th, we all know what happened. And I think that the people who attacked the United States of America on January 6th do not feel as if they were historically criminal. And that's a problem we have in this country. And it is a result of how we teach history. And I think the fact that history is treated the way it is treated has to do, or I guess my question is, do we feel that history is treated the way it's treated because of the way over the years it has been passed down, because lies have been passed down as history? Books have been written with lies in them as history. So the question is, how can we as theoreticians, politicians, parents, help a situation in which something that is as critical as the knowledge of who we are as a people is treated so lightly? And I guess the question is for all of you, but particularly for Professor Dixon.
Proctor.
Yeah, I just, and I'll,
Did you want to comment on?
You go ahead.
are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll keep it quick. Yeah. History challenge, keep it quick. To answer your question, I think for a long time history was taught, to accommodate the dominant group, white Americans, and lots got left out. Many things were distorted, and like you say, in some cases, complete lies. And I think it wasn't all that engaging, because I think at some level a lot of people realized there was more to all this story than what coach was teaching me or whatever, or my high school history teacher. And so it kind of got a reputation for being boring, or they're just going through a timeline. The methods weren't always so great. So it kind of didn't have a big following. And then when the society opened up with the civil rights movement and everything else, suddenly we're talking about history, but there's lots of untold history that's now suddenly bursting out from every direction. And so people who were taught in that traditional way are like, what's going on? I mean, these were heroes, these were our ancestors, they're great. I mean, that's, okay, we're done with that. Well, now all these things are coming out, you know. So how do we wrestle with that? And if you're not that interested in history, you don't know much about it, or you've got other things, other jobs, it just gets confusing and annoying, and we'll just make it go away then. You know, I don't want to deal with this. So I think the challenge is to be broad and encompassing and try to teach all the stories, and everything together, because it is all related. It's not just Black History Month or Women's History Month or whatever, and then the inevitable comeback, well, where's White History Month? You know, history is all tied together, and there isn't these separate pieces that we do. So, and I went on too long, but that's anything we can do. You join local museums, make sure when you go back to your communities, tell people at least join one museum society. At least write one letter to your legislator about the importance of history, or specifically May 20th, since we've been talking about that, but just history in general. Those are the things you can do, but I think with suddenly so many Americans are trying to address the entirety of our history, it's confusing, it makes people mad who were taught that, hey, these were my ancestors, they were the good side, and all of a sudden here you are telling me this. And not everybody responds like a history professor. You know, most people respond from where they grew up or where they're coming from and whatnot. So those are our challenges. It's a terrific point that you made. And I will definitely.
Another response.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, I would like to add, it behooves every one of us as an individual, because one person can make a difference. It's our responsibility to research the history. And for African American, a lot of our history was handed down by word of mouth. It was by codes. This morning when they were singing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, if you research that song, you know what that song was talking about. It wasn't talking about a chariot coming from heaven. It was talking about the man who was going to come up the river and help these people escape. So people deny our history because they say it's not documented. We weren't allowed to document because, number one, we didn't want the plantation owners and the slave owners to know that we were planning an escape. So it's our responsibility to get as much history as we can from our ancestors. In my book, I interviewed a lady that was 106 years old. The people I interviewed were from 60 to 106. I reviewed 14 hours of former slaves' tapes, and those tapes are housed at Fisk University now, of former slaves, what they talked about, the truth. We have to learn the truth, and the truth will stand the span of time. So each one of us must find someone that can give us the history. People don't believe that the code was in the quilt, or they don't believe the code was in the songs. But if you talk to the older people, they will tell you. I can't tell you what a dog is thinking, but I can tell you what my ancestors know. I can't tell you what someone else felt or what their history was, but I can tell you I had a great 4-generation removed grandfather that was a former slave. I had a great-great-grandfather that was a former slave, and they passed down history by word of mouth. And we have to seek that out, and we have to document it, and have to believe that it's true. And we have to learn what the truth is so that we can recognize when something is told that's not true.
I think you had it.
What does the word buffalo come from to describe?
Get the question in the mic so it'll be on the video.
My question is, how does the word buffalo, where did that come from in terms of describing the African-American soldiers? Why buffalo soldiers?
Thank you, sir. Oh, thank you, sir. If you go back in history and you look at the indigenous people, their subsistence came from basically one animal, the buffalo or the bison. And the black man, when they were sent out west, because after the Civil War, they weren't allowed east of the Mississippi because the white people didn't want all those black men with guns in their neighborhoods. So they sent them out west. That westward movement that we hear about. But the black men, their ferocity in fighting is like a wounded buffalo. Their hair gave resemblance of the buffalo. In the wintertime, they wore buffalo robes. So the indigenous people equated their fighting spirit with that of the bison. And then, of course, the shaggy hair, their general appearance. But we want to say that the indigenous people never did call the black troopers buffalo soldiers. That's purely European. They were called wild buffalo and not buffalo soldiers. That didn't come to near the end of the century. And once again, that's a European term. It wasn't a term used by the indigenous people themselves.
Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both for your presentation and the passionate work you do with history. I'm not a historian, so I'm approaching this as an educator and just a general citizen. Several of you mentioned why history is important. You said words to the effect that if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it, especially the mistakes of history. So in that vein, I was wondering, as you speak to people in your various roles as historians, do people, especially young people, do they understand that there's this thread of history that links what's happening today with the historical antecedents of what has happened? For example, do they understand that the wealth gap we see today is related to the history of how we came to be to this moment? Do they understand that the mass incarceration and the disproportionate number of African Americans in prison is related to what happened in that history? Are they linking it to the problems we see today?
There's a lot, again, packed away in that question. We're in the last half an hour of this session, so again, we'll try to keep it short so we can be dynamic. Any responses to?
Yeah, a lot of what's been said, and Richard, you're going to have to start traveling with me so I don't have to answer that question. Because when people see me in the uniform of the United States Colored Troop, they say Buffalo Soldiers, so I have to tell the story like Richard is. So Richard, you can save me a few words. But the biggest thing is we hear about revised history, revisionist history. Who wrote it? Where were they thinking about, and what were they looking at? When if you don't know your own history, someone else will tell it for you. And they're not going to tell it like you know it. You know, that's what I find more than anything. There are a lot of stories that I read and that I hear. My history. I didn't need anybody else to tell me about my history. My great-great-great-grandmother, Jane Rosar, was born on the Rosar Plantation in Hawkinsville, Georgia. I passed 75 Hawkinsville, Georgia, years going to Atlanta. Did not know that my roots was in those cotton fields over there. John Rosar released had in his will, we have a copy of his will from 1859. My great-great-great-grandmother, Jane, moved to Wakulla County, what they call Sop Choppy now, with her 5 boys, Alfred, James, Thomas, Jonas, and Ephraim. Ephraim was my great-great-grandfather. Ephraim, they moved, and then Ephraim married Violet, and they had Shedrick. Shedrick married Fanny. They had Henrietta. Henrietta married Eugene. Eugene had Eugene. Eugene had married Emma, and they had Sergeant Major Rozier. So no one has to tell me my history, and no one should ever tell you your history. Research your history. That's what we're doing here now. We're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, the history of Emancipation Proclamation, and no one should ever have to tell us that. We know May 20th it happened. We know how it happened. We know when it happened. You know, when the Emancipation Proclamation came about, it was a war document. Like Clifton said, it's a war document. And it only was a war document to only be able to act it because you had to have an adversary in a war, and that was the Confederacy. The preliminary was written in September 22nd, 1862, and then issued and signed January 1. Only after William Seward, Secretary of the Army, said we need to have a great battle before we can make it known, so we could seem as though we're progressing. That battle was the Battle of Antietam, and it happened September 17 in 1862, when over 2,300 casualties. After that, days after that, the preliminary proclamation was issued. Then the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1, 1863. 2.5 years later, Florida it was read at the Knott House that we reenact. So no one can tell your history better than you. So to deny your history is to deny your existence. I say it again, relationship of history to a people is like that, a mother to a child. It doesn't separate. It just gets better.
And let me mention that my good friend is testing me out. The Battle of Antietam produced about 23,000
23,000, I said.
not 2,300.
23,000, my bad, I'm sorry. 23,000, yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this panel. I'm Doretha Hare Truesdale, and it has been so enlightening to me over all the years of my life. I'm in the process of opening the Florida Highwayman Museum and African American Museum in Fort Pierce, Florida. The highwayman history is not the truth. How can I change it when I'm opening a museum? Am I going to go with what has been written as the truth? Or do I tell the truth? Anybody?
I would tell the truth. I mean, if it's documented truth, and you see that it's not documented truth that's being relayed, get it to the ears that need to hear it, just like Juneteenth. It's not the truth, but it's been made a holiday. So I think it's in that same instance, get that to the ears of those that who are making it happen, and produce the evidence, because the evidence was produced right here in the state of Florida, but still, it was looked over because we wanted to follow 46 other states that wanted to do something like that.
But
Yeah, so.
it said that it makes the story much more interesting.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's just like
Than the truth.
it was a catchphrase, Juneteenth.
Yes.
So it sounded better than May 20th.
Yes.
So, yeah.
My second question is for you. When you do the enactment, is it everything? My husband was asked to do an enactment, but he said he didn't want to wear raggedy clothes and go barefoot. Is
Okay.
that what?
No, I've been reenacting for 10 years. I never wore raggedy clothes and went barefoot. I represent those that brought it to where we are right now.
All right.
There are over 209,000 African Americans that fought during the Civil War. Over 68,000 gave their life.
Okay.
2,700 on the battlefield. We represent those. We also represent those that they were freeing, our ancestors. So there, when you do reenactments, there are different portions that you do. In our unit, please stop by our display outside there. We tell the story of those soldiers, an actual soldier, and the others that came through as well. We also have a ladies' auxiliary that tell the stories of the civilians as well. We have a youth assembly that tells the stories of the kids coming up. So reenactment is, you know, like I said, I tell people, most people think that during that time that all blacks were slaves. Not so. You know, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in January 1, 1863, tell your husband, get in touch with me. I got a uniform for him. You don't have to wear rags and go barefooted. Okay, we can make this thing happen. You know, and but you know, Frederick Douglass. Everybody heard of Frederick. There were many other abolitionists during that time: Mary Shad Curry, Elizabeth Bowser, William Floyd. I just go through the list that were telling the story. And when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, before Frederick Douglass was an advocate to get African Americans to fight for the Civil War. But then many of them thought, well, why would I want to fight for a white man's law? But it wasn't. It was a war that could free us. And a lot of those that joined were free men in the North area, but they felt if their brothers and sisters were enslaved in the South, we're still enslaved as well. You know, Frederick Douglass said, on one of his famous speeches in talking, he said, give a black man the brass letters U.S. across his chest, eagles on his button, a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket. There's no man and nobody that can deny he has gained the right to citizenship. He said, from east to west and north to south, the sky is written all over. Liberty now and never, to arms fight. Yes. He said, remember Jim Massey and Charleston. Remember Shields, Green, and Copeland that followed noble John Brown and fell as glorious martyrs for the cause of the slave. He said, in a contest of oppression, the Almighty has no attributes for the oppressor. So, you know,
Tell the truth.
we had to tell the truth, and that's what you do, tell the truth.
Thank you.
What I'd like to do as we enter the last segment of it, I just want to mention that we talk about the history of the Emancipation Proclamation. I want to touch upon a couple of things. Number one, I think it's been well known that Lincoln did not want to issue the proclamation. He wanted an alternative. The alternative Lincoln wanted was, as I mentioned earlier, was compensated emancipation. What that would have involved is that Lincoln wanted each state to pass a state law outlawing slavery in that state. And then the slave holders would be compensated some amount, let's say $600 for each slave that they gave up. At the time that the law was supposedly passed, each slave at the age of 35 or over 35 would be freed. And every year thereafter, as the slave became 35, the slaveholder would free them. What he was trying to avoid was to flood the system with 4 million dependent individuals. He wanted there to be a gradual process so that theoretically it would take about 35 years for slavery to end. But let me mention that Lincoln had privately said to his cabinet, yes, it would appear that it would take 35 years, but do you honestly believe once so many slaves became free that their brothers and sisters would remain? It will not take that long. There will be a rebellion. But that's what he wanted, the gradual and compensated emancipation, largely to compensate those slaveholders much like Europe did, because the banking system in the North held notes. You know, they had loaned money to the slaveholders, and those slaves were being used as collateral for those notes. If you automatically freed those slaves, theoretically it could cause the banking system to collapse because the slave owners could not pay those notes. So Lincoln was trying to avoid that. He also wanted colonization. Of course, Frederick Douglass and others put a pretty quick end to that idea of colonization. But so that initially he wanted three components: gradual compensation and colonization to be a part of this. That didn't happen, and so he went with what Congress often refers to as the nuclear option. Signing of the Emancipation Proclamation was like the nuclear option. It was like dropping a bomb on the Confederacy. Lincoln described the Emancipation Proclamation for all the things his administration achieved during his period as a wartime president: the expansion of the railroad, expansion of the telegraph, the expansion, almost creation of the banking system. Lincoln had a lot of achievement during his period of time, but he said that the Emancipation Proclamation is the central act of my administration and a main event of the 19th century. He recognized that. One final point, and I'll also turn it over to you guys, that the 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6, 1865. That was a half a year after Lincoln was assassinated, and yet his signature appears on the bottom of the 13th Amendment. Lincoln not only drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, he also drafted the 13th Amendment. After Congress approved the 13th Amendment, I think it was in February of 1865, Lincoln recognized the importance of that 13th Amendment, and so as soon as it hit his desk, and before he sent it on to the state, Illinois being the first state to be ratified, he signed it. And he said, with trembling hands, he cannot imagine doing anything more momentous than signing that decree. It was highly unusual for a president to sign a constitutional amendment before it was ratified. But recognizing its importance, Lincoln signed it. And within a matter of weeks, he was assassinated. So that's why his signature appears. Just want to kind of make sure we stick with the history of the Emancipation Proclamation. The other point is that a lot of what's circulating today as the Emancipation Proclamation is, in fact, the preliminary document. When Lincoln signed the document on September 22nd, 1862, Tennessee was not in it as an excluded state. But when he signed the final document, January 1st, he added Tennessee to that. So if you're reading the Emancipation Proclamation, wherever you might read it, you don't see the state of Tennessee as being excluded. You're actually looking at the preliminary document. Just wanted to mention that. There's a lot to that history, and it was a process. There was no single date. Yeah. And as we asked any, I see another fan?
One other point to that, not to, but there's a lot to this that we'll never get to. We were talking about that, but and just to kind of piggy off on what Mr. Lewis just said. Remember, the Emancipation Proclamation was a war document.
It was.
And it was only put into action because of an adversary. But Abraham Lincoln also knew that when the end of the Civil War came, when General Lee went to Appomattox and signed over and gave in, or whatever you want to call it, to General Grant there at Appomattox, that was the end of the war. So Abraham Lincoln and the cap, they also knew that we needed to come up with something else because the war document is over, so the Emancipation Proclamation is kind of gone. So that's when the 13th Amendment started coming into play, 13th Amendment to the 13th Amendment. And then we also look at the reading of the 13th Amendment when we think we saw that on the movie. It talks about and not in servitude or crime, okay? And that's why we say African Americans were still enslaved. It's called slavery by another name. That's when you came out with the chain gangs and things of that nature. African Americans, freed slaves being arrested and sent off to state labor for just loitering or any small crime or saying something back to someone. So there's so much. There's so much. Go ahead. I didn't want to bring that up there.
And I just want to mention, too, that, let me mention one other point. When Lincoln is accused of not doing a lot of things, we need to keep in mind that General Lee surrendered on April the 9th, almost the date that the shot was fired on Fort Sumter. That was almost 4 years to the date, April the 9th, when the war effectively ended. April the 14th, 1 week later, Lincoln was assassinated. He had no opportunity to guide his Reconstruction Act. He was assassinated. He was killed. And so amidst all this jubilation, Frederick Douglass was at Fort Sumter when the news arrived that Lincoln had been assassinated. There was a lot of rejoicing, great jubilation, and so forth. And Douglass was asked, what was it like when news hit that Lincoln was assassinated? And in his poetic way, Douglass said, it was as if a giant earthquake had opened up and swallowed one of our chief towns or cities. He said, the sensation of horror could not have been more profound. It was as if every man in it heard a voice from heaven and paused to learn its meaning, end quote. So amid the jubilation, there was great sadness because Lincoln was almost immediately assassinated. And so we blame him for what he didn't do, but he wasn't around to get it done. So those are my comments. I think there's a question on the floor.
I really appreciate being here today and hearing what you have to say. And it's mind-boggling to me how much there is out there and how much we don't know. And I had two questions. I did take a class from you, and you did mention that our history books were not written from true history. They were written from newspapers that some university, whose name I forget, pulled together the information from newspapers and wrote the history, and it became the definitive history, and it was a lie. And, you know, but one simple question, as I wondered what does exemplary education for the county mean? I'm not quite sure what that means. I'd like to hear what that is. But the other question I had was, with there being so much out there about the emancipation, and emancipation did not happen everywhere at the same time, and the lot of the people was different, may have been different in some of the states as it happened, is there such a thing as an emancipation museum so we can have a place where we can go and look and say, in all, however many states there were at that point, this happened this day and this is where it was, this happened this day and this is where it was, you know, something that gives us something to hang our hat on. And is there such a possibility as looking at, say, for instance, what is it, we're celebrating December 6th, the 13th Amendment.
13th Amendment to 13th.
That we can hang our hats on as the day and do a celebration of that. I know it's in December, you know, but something needs to pull it together for us. And celebrating emancipation, the August the 8th, June the 19th, May 20th, January 6th, April 8th, does not pull it together for us quite as good as we need to. Is there a way we can celebrate each state's emancipation without losing the fact of emancipation, period, and the 13th Amendment?
I think it's, what's the phrase? The horse is already out the barn. With the national holiday of Juneteenth, saying that that's the day that all slaves are free. It wasn't until the 13th Amendment, when those states, Kentucky, Delaware, Oklahoma, and territories that hadn't became states yet, would be an ideal. But each state has a different date of emancipation. So if each state could, you know, glorify their date, that would be ideal. But who's to say to bring that all together now that we've signed and stamped something that isn't true, to change that? It's a good point.
Let me mention this, that one of the difficulties you're dealing with here is that the America of today, most of this America was not involved in that America. California and other places. Even I was discussing the issue with the person from South Florida. They mentioned that they knew nothing about May 20th in Miami. I said, well, there was no Miami in 1865. It didn't exist. And so we have to keep that in mind. So you have states like California, states out in the West and in the North, Northeast, who were not involved, who are now looking for something to commemorate. I don't mind celebrating Juneteenth. I'm from Louisiana originally. And I can remember growing up with my aunts and uncles would come down on June 19th party and having a good time, and a month later they were back again for July the 4th. I didn't have any idea why they had two Independence Days. But so I have no problem. I recognize being symbolic of independence. And if they want me to celebrate freedom on July the 4th, I mean June 19th, I will. But we need to keep in mind what history was. Richard?
Yeah, my intention was not to eliminate each state doing what they do, but to bring some recognition to the act of emancipation as, you know, as a national thing.
Something like emancipation calendar would do so. Just, I wanted to say one thing. I have a brochure here. We wanted to talk a little bit more about Florida's history and the Emancipation of the United States Colored Troop involvement.
Excuse me, 5 minutes.
Okay, this is a brochure that my unit produced, and we sent this out to over 1,400 schools in the state of Florida. We didn't send it to the districts because we didn't want it to get in the basket and never get to the schools. But it tells the history of the United States Colored Troop and tells the history of its leading up to the Emancipation Proclamation. And if you open it all the way up, it shows where 17 battles in the state of Florida what United States colored troops involvement was, and a lot of people aren't aware of that, but you all are now. And if you get this, it has that information in it. I'll just tell this quick story. I know I got a minute. But when we sent this out, the first school that responded and asked us to come and talk to them and put on display was elementary school in Weehawken, Florida. Weehawken, Brother Gully, you know probably about 5 or 6 blacks that live in this. Now, I'm just exaggerating. But the school asked us to come down, and we went down and presented the history here. And it was one little fellow, like I said, the hardest ones are the elementary and kindergarten. The one little fellow said, my granddaddy told me that y'all burned down his barn. Y'all burned down my granddaddy's barn. And I wanted to say, war is hell, but I couldn't. So you have to come down a little bit there. I say that may be true, but your granddad probably burned down a few of our barns too. So, we're all here to make ends meet now. But please stop by and get one of these. I have one for you, and it's some information in there as well that they may not have gotten to.
Before you cut us off, please, give our guests from Tennessee perhaps an opportunity to say something before we wrap up.
I know what I was going to say. I had to senior mama for a minute. When you said that school, that district that accepted your pamphlet, I had that same experience with my book. My book is about slavery and the evolution of education. More white folks about the book than black folks. That's just the way it is. They're interested in that history. No. And you made me think about that. Right. I've enjoyed being here. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for the opportunity to speak. I know that we're limited with time. Thank you, Sergeant Major Rozier, for your comments, and I want to thank all of you all for being here and presenting this information. I know we're limited to talking about the proclamation, but I do need to make a comment. One of the things that you talked about and what we've discussed is that we have to tell our own history, and Jarvis, you talked about that. As a sibling, well, I'm the only surviving sibling now, but as a child of parents who did a lot of work, multifaceted work, especially in the area of civil rights, there were things that I didn't know. And I am working now and have been doing so for a while to make sure that my children and my grandchildren know. We have to tell those things. It starts at home, as you said. We have to know our own history. The other comment I wanted to make was that when we talk about teaching kids history, and I'm trying to hurry up, we've got to make it relevant. Because young people don't want to hear about something that they said, well, this happened 400 years ago. We have to make it relevant. We have to let them understand that the prisons now are the new plantations. That's what we're dealing with now. And as a part of having that free labor, those are the same young people that you're trying to teach to are going to be the ones who are going to be in prison providing the free labor. The other thing I wanted to say was that we've got to find a way to, I don't know how we let certain people take this, make this argument or fabricate this argument that teaching history now is critical race theory. We've got to do something about that. We've got to work collectively. And the last thing I wanted to say is that as we discuss which date, whether it's June 19th, whether it's August 8th for your state, I'd rather see Congress pass a voting rights bill than for them to pass legislation that says, celebrate one of these days, take your pick, to celebrate the end of slavery. Because unless we're able to vote, we're not free. We're not free now. But we will certainly go back, and we're going to go back in time when we take away that right for us to vote. And I think that while this is a wonderful conference and we have to talk about these things, we've got to talk about some other things too. We've got to talk about how we make sure that we don't lose our freedom in another instance of losing our rights to vote.
Amen.
Thank you. My name is Maggie B. Lewis Butler. I have enjoyed being your monitor. I want you to know this has been a very good panel. Let's get a panel with hands. We have learned so much. Thank you. I want you to know, I wanted to share this at the end. Lincoln said, if I could save the Union without freeing a slave, I would. Yep. I remember that. Thank you.